What is amazing is the number of people who should be mainstream figures who have been dancing to Musk's and therefore by extension Robinson's tune.
And it was a pretty strong and pretty robust performance, I think, from Starmer. And as he said there, I don't mind the cut and thrust of policy, but I don't want to start talking and amplifying lies that have come from this bloke who simply picked up his phone 20 years after the scandal erupted, who knows nothing about the UK or the grooming scandal, who probably doesn't give a damn about the victims of grooming, but wants somehow to support the man who he thinks of as a free speech martyr, even though this man is currently or has been serving jail time for contempt of court. He's not a hero for anything at all.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case.
That is Keir Starmer this morning, taking head-on the story that has essentially dominated the airwaves and the political discussion over the weekend. And he's firmly come out on the side of those who want to put Elon Musk and his followers back in their box.
But it isn't just Starmer that Elon Musk has a problem with. In the last 24 hours, he's even fallen out with Nigel Farage, someone we had all thought he was going to back with his own money. Where does this war of words in every direction leave Musk power, leave Starmer, and leave the question which is now dominating British politics around Asian and Muslim grooming gangs? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And our little Antipodean friend is in New Zealand, messaging things like
Sounds
Kia
like a
ora.
kangaroo or something. A little Antipodean.
Oh,
Joey.
Sopel.
Joey.
Yes, we've lost him anyway, down under, for a week or so.
No one knows.
No one quite
He'll
knows.
bounce back. He'll hop back at some point in the next couple of
With
weeks.
something in his pouch.
Yeah.
Tim Tams, if I know him. But we're going to start with Keir Starmer, who was ostensibly and in fact practically making a speech this morning about the NHS and about the changes that he wants to bring in there. But he was asked questions at the end about a story that has threatened to, I would say sideline, but really come to dominate the whole discourse of what is going on between world leaders in America, and by that I mean Trump and Musk, and the potential for who leads Britain here. And I was given a heads up yesterday when I was asked what the position of the Labour government was towards Elon Musk now. And I was told that there would be something about Jess Phillips in the speech. So he knew he was going to be asked about that, and he knew he was going to respond to it. And I thought it would help if we just set out where we've come to, how we've got here, because your head will be full of snippets and tweets
And mince pies and the remnants thereof.
pies, and maybe we can just sort of try and provide a bit of clarity.
Yeah, this has been rumbling over the Christmas New Year period, really, and particularly since January the 1st. Most people who are not terminally online or terminally plugged into Musk's brain, chronically, like many of us unfortunately have to be, may not have noticed it or only noticed it in the last 24 hours. But basically, over the last sort of 5 days or so, 10 days, Musk, who already, as we know, had developed something of an obsession with British politics, pretty much since the riots, the far-right riots that took place in the summer, has, even by his standards, seemed particularly frenzied and fevered. And in particular has alighted on one issue, which is this question around Asian or Muslim grooming gangs in the UK. Now, that itself is not a new story. That is a very old story. It's actually a story that was a big story in the last decade, so 2013, 2014, when lots of journalists, mainstream media journalists, and we'll return to that point, uncovered evidence that there were several, particularly in several northern English towns, grooming gangs that were dominated by Asian or Muslim men. And there were appalling crimes where dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds of young girls and women were sexually abused, raped, and worse. Musk basically has seemingly discovered this in the last 5 to 10 days for the first time. Indeed, he has tweeted about it more than 40 times in the last 24 hours alone, blaming Keir Starmer in particular for it, arguing that, quotes, rape gangs were allowed to exploit young girls without facing justice when he was DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions.
And calling Starmer complicit in, and I quote, the rape of Britain.
The rape of Britain, indeed. And he's, used loads of sort of hard right tropes, including calling him two-tier Keir, saying that there was no justice for severe violent crimes, but there is prison for social media posts. And this all centres on what has long been a source of concern and agitation, not just for the right in Britain, but generally, which is that there is lots of inquiries have said that one of the reasons these grooming gangs occurred and were ignored for too long is because there was some sensitivity at a local level and by the police and other authorities for appearing racist or who were concerned about cultural sensitivities, which is true. But this has been taken to another level and out of all proportion by Musk, culminating in that tweet that you've mentioned, Emily, directed at Jess Phillips in particular, who at the start of the year, in response to Oldham Council, one of the areas affected by this grooming gang story, who had suggested that it might be an idea to have a national inquiry, Jess Phillips, who is the Labour MP and safeguarding minister, said that this was not necessary because we've had multiple inquiries over the years, including a national inquiry which reported by Alexis Jay as recently as 2022, and lots of local inquiries as well. When this news broke, Musk went crazy and, among other things, tweeted that Jess Phillips was a, quote, rape genocide apologist, whatever that means. And that tweet has been seen 43 million times.
We're going to come on to what happened in Rotherham and give a little bit of background to that later in the episode. But here's Keir Starmer now laying out just where he stands on Elon Musk's interjections.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career. And so just as I took on the criminal justice system and the institutions when I was chief prosecutor, I'm prepared to call out this for what it is. We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed. I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate that we must have, but that's got to be based on facts and truth, not on lies, not on those who are so desperate for attention that they're prepared to debase themselves and their country. So this government will get on with the job of protecting victims, including child sexual abuse, mandatory reporting, accelerating the processes. But what I won't tolerate is this discussion and debate based on lies without calling it out. What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it, now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying. So that's what I say about Jess Phillips.
Quite skillfully done there by Starmer, because he doesn't mention Musk by name. He doesn't mention the Tory leader by name, Kemi Badenoch, although he will come on and do that. And he also keeps referring throughout the whole of the Q&A session today to Twitter and tweeting. It's this sort of gentle roast of Elon Musk, as if to say, I don't know what your platform is or who you are. I'd much prefer to be talking about the NHS, but needs must. I'm going on and doing this. And it was a pretty strong and pretty robust performance, I think, from Starmer, who basically felt that he had to come to the defence not just of Jess Phillips, not just of the woman who's in his cabinet who he knows has spent her life working towards sort of helping victims of domestic abuse, women and children, but also to the defence of what political conversation should be about. And as he said there, I don't mind the cut and thrust of policy, but I don't want to start talking and amplifying lies that have come from this bloke who simply picked up his phone 20 years after the scandal erupted, who knows nothing about the UK or the grooming scandal, who probably doesn't give a damn about the victims of grooming, but wants somehow to support the man who he thinks of as a free speech martyr, even though this man is currently or has been serving jail time for contempt of court. He's not a hero for anything at all.
Yeah, and I think Tommy Robinson, real name Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Britain's best known far-right figure, is bizarrely central to this. And he's central to this in the sense that it seems pretty clear from what we can see from Musk's Twitter timeline that one of the reasons that Musk has become so interested in this issue is that he has been watching, and indeed advising his 200 million followers to watch, several of Tommy Robinson's quote-unquote documentaries, where Robinson basically sets himself up as someone who has been punished and penalised and imprisoned by the British state for quote-unquote exposing the horror of Muslim grooming gangs, when the rest of the British establishment and the state and whatever was ignoring it, completely ignoring, and that has led Musk to say, among other things, that Robinson is a political prisoner. Completely ignoring the fact that, of course, this is a complete nonsense conspiracy. It was mainstream media who exposed it. It was government.
Famously Andrew Norfolk at the Times,
Indeed.
who was one of the first journalists over a decade ago to start saying we have to call this out for what it is, and it looks as if it is particular Muslim Asian gangs raping young women who are vulnerable and underage.
Totally. And we know some of the things, including the fact that there was cultural concern and sensitivities which shouldn't have been there, partly because there have been so many local and indeed national inquiries which have told us that, right? But that is completely absent from Musk's view and obviously from Robinson's view. But what is amazing, what I think is really amazing, and Starmer gets onto this, and I have to say, I think actually this was, Starmer's best moment since he became PM. He knew he had to kind of articulate some of this stuff because the ferocity of Musk's attack had become so intense, particularly over the last few weeks. What is amazing is the number of people who should be mainstream figures in the press, in politics, in broadcasting, including, I would say, the top of the Conservative Party, who have been dancing to Musk's and therefore by extension Robinson's tune, pretending and saying that there is, and suggesting and hinting that this is part of a kind of mass state cover-up, which people including Starmer have been part of. And I think actually Starmer put that best actually in a section when he was pressed on Musk's role, when he was asked about Musk. And again, he sidestepped Musk directly and basically put Kemi Badenoch and others at the top of the Conservative Party in his crosshairs.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You say the sort of language Elon Musk uses matters to democracy here and has a serious negative impact on it. Musk is in a couple of weeks' time going to be a senior member of the US administration led by Donald Trump. So are you taking this as direct attack from his administration, and will you ask Trump to tone it down?
I'm actually making a more general point. I'm not going to individualise this. to Elon Musk or anybody else. I'm making more because actually I'm very concerned about where the Tory party is going on this in this country, because they are not. I think only a few months ago it would have been unthinkable for things to have been said about Jess Phillips that were said recently, without all political parties and the leader of the opposition calling it out in terms. I genuinely believe that. I don't think it was that long ago that you would have all expected that reaction. You'd have all been challenging the leader of the opposition. Will you denounce this? This isn't fair, because it's put a member of Parliament, my member of Parliament, at risk. That's not good. That's why I say a line's been crossed. So this isn't about America or Musk. I'm talking about our politics. I'm talking about the responsibility that our politicians have in calling this out for what it is and distancing themselves and condemning it. Because if you're not prepared to stand up as a Tory MP and denounce what's been said about Jess Phillips, who's now had threats made to her, then you need to seriously consider why you're in politics in the first place, in my view.
And I think what that speaks to is what I think is central to this story, which is, and we've seen it play out in real time, what we've seen, and it's been developing for a long time, but I now think it is just dominant. What we've seen, right, is the emergence of a kind of online, pretty hard right, Anglosphere online world with a fusion between the UK and US kind of hard right thinking and people. And Musk is kind of central to that. And what affects, because Musk is so powerful and because he's got so many followers, it's clear, it seems to me, that Musk has been radicalized. He's been radicalized. And what he is doing in putting these subjects and flooding our political ecosystem with such misinformation and lies and conspiracy is that his radicalization is radicalizing a good proportion of British politics, including quite a bit of the mainstream right in this country. And I think that is what is dangerous here. And I think Starmer is completely spot on there, which is that I think even a few months ago, I think he's right, I think Sunak would have denounced that language. I even had Chris Philp, a perfectly reasonable person who was a Shadow Home Secretary on my LBC show yesterday. He said it wasn't language he would have used, but he wouldn't condemn it. Richard Tice, the Deputy Leader of Reform, and let's remember, we're talking about Elon Musk calling Jess Phillips a rape genocide apologist. Richard Tice refused, and I asked him multiple times to condemn it. And when he wouldn't condemn it, I just said, well, you would accept that it's factually wrong, wouldn't you? And he just said, I don't know what Jess Phillips is.
The reality is we live in a world of free speech. Mr. Musk is entitled to say what he wants.
Sure, and you would agree that it's wrong.
We all might use different language. I will use my language. Mr. Musk will use his, and other people will use theirs.
But you'd agree it's factually wrong.
I want to know why Jess Phillips is rejecting a national inquiry.
But would you agree that it's factually wrong? That she is not a rape genocide apologist?
I don't know what Jess
You
Phillips
won't even
is.
say
I don't know
that.
why she's rejected this inquiry.
What is rape genocide? What is a rape genocide apologist? What is it? You won't say that it's wrong. You won't say that Jess Phillips is not a rape genocide apologist.
What I will say is, why is Jess Phillips rejecting a national inquiry? It's as simple as that.
The whole point, the whole USP of Kemi Badenoch was that she was meant to be the common sense choice. She was meant to be the person who didn't shy away from, calling a spade, getting on with it, being very factual about what was going on. Not that she was open to conspiracy, not that she was open to being dragged down a line that was being a trap, essentially, that was being set for her by a very influential billionaire. And it's not just Kemi Badenoch. Liz Truss here has said, this is Jess Phillips, the same Home Office minister who excused masked Islamicist thugs. Her title, Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Safeguarding Violence Against Women and Girls, is a perversion of the English language. It's clear whose side she's on. Let's break that down for a second. That's a former Prime Minister suggesting that a Minister of the State is on the side of criminals. Islamists and criminals. And I just think that we are in a very weird place, which is arguably not that unhelpful to Keir Starmer now. Everyone's been going on about this incredibly rocky start he's had, and hasn't he had an awful start, and hasn't it been the worst 6 months, and the polls are showing it's the most unpopular start of all. I think what has happened over the last 48 hours has actually and weirdly helped him enormously, because he's basically putting clear blue water between a party that, you know, will get a lot of stuff wrong, will make a lot of mistakes, but fundamentally adheres to the rule of law and to truth and to fact-checking, and to parties
and isn't frenzied and fevered about every issue.
And weak enough to follow the very kind of traps being set by somebody who just wants to stir trouble. It's very clear that Elon Musk just wants to create a lot of chaos, not just here, but also in Europe. You know, one of the things we were talking about earlier was whether Elon Musk is just like on a different time zone to everyone else. So he wakes up very early. His timeline is full of, you know, UK Twitter, UK, you know, news. And so he starts
and he speaks the language.
And he speaks the language. He gets very, very impassioned about whatever's going on in our country. What kind of leader wants to sort of take that on and say, oh, yes, you're very worried about that, sir. I'll come right back to you on that. I'll call for an inquiry. That's madness.
Well, it's Kemi Badenoch, apparently.
Right.
This is where I think this is a massive problem. And it's an ironic problem, right, which is that so many of these people, who the people I would call the kind of illiberal metropolitan elites, they constantly believe that they're speaking on behalf of the country overall and a sort of an imagined majority, which very often doesn't exist. This is a classic example of actually where the online world, fueled by Musk, is taking them down extremely niche, esoteric, frenzied and fringe positions, right? Because, as we know from the polling, Elon Musk is actually very unpopular in Britain. Many of these positions are extreme, and they justify it by saying, and we've heard, you know, Richard Tice has done it, Farage has done it, Kemi Badenoch has done it. Even they just say, well, Elon Musk, that's free speech. We're free speech champions. As if somehow free speech entitles you, or in Musk's case, to his own facts. It isn't about speech.
Well,
it's about what is correct and what is incorrect, what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, Robinson's literally serving jail time for repeating libelous and false allegations against a Syrian refugee. I mean, that's not free speech. That's just libel. You know, sometimes you have to call these things what they actually are if you believe in language.
They're being short-circuited by their own brains at this point, by a complete misunderstanding of and perversion of free speech, a kind of free speech ideology, which is leading them down bizarre paths.
When we come back, we're going to be talking about the role that Nigel Farage is playing in this whole Musk circus. So one thing that made Keir Starmer's speech today slightly easier, I would say, and gave him essentially a sort of free hand at Musk, is that overnight Musk bizarrely, quite unexpectedly, changed his allegiance and called for the leader of the Reform Party, Nigel Farage, to go. Now, to take you back to earlier on Sunday, Nigel Farage was asked about his friendship with Musk, and in particular his disagreement over Tommy Robinson, who we were explaining before. Farage has, to his credit, I think, always kept distance between him and Tommy Robinson. He thinks of him as a communal garden thug, and he's never particularly welcomed him into the party or indeed welcomed his politics. And Farage was asked whether he would be prepared to tell Musk he was wrong on Laura Kuenssberg's Sunday show. And this is what he said to the BBC.
Would you tell Elon Musk that he is wrong? So I know you've distanced yourself from his comments about Tommy Robinson.
Do you know what? Real friends, when they meet face to face, have conversations, and they agree to agree, and sometimes they agree to disagree. The point is, the fact that he supports me politically and supports reform doesn't mean I have to agree with every single statement he makes on X. And I think you're getting bogged down in this. You know, I will, at the inauguration, have a conversation with him on a variety of things. This will no doubt be one of them. But I think the media are getting too hung up on this. You know, frankly, what he says about other people, what his views on electric vehicles are, or whatever it may be, isn't relevant.
So Nigel Farage is going to talk to his real friend at the inauguration and have a conversation about what Elon Musk is getting wrong. Meanwhile, real friend Elon Musk does what?
He says, literally 2 hours after that, or 3 hours after that was broadcast, he calls for Nigel Farage to be replaced as Reform leader, saying that he doesn't have what it takes. Indeed, a few hours after that, Musk decided to weigh in, suggesting that the MP for Great Yarmouth, Rupert Lowe, a man who has distinguished himself in Parliament so far for, as we've reported on this show, for spreading conspiracies around cow additives.
So very much a Musk man. I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah. And weighing in on the World Bowls Championship, putting them under some pressure, might be a better leader than Nigel Farage. So, which prompted Farage himself to tweet a few hours after that, obviously completely blindsided by it, humiliating in all sorts of ways, tweeting saying, well, this is a surprise. Elon is a remarkable individual, but on this, I'm afraid I disagree. My view remains that Tommy Robinson is not right for reform, and I will never sell out my principles. Which is, what Farage is doing there? He is making the best out of a bad situation.
Okay, so I think there are two ways you can look at this. One is it is devastating, it's humiliating, and it may very well see reform, panic and sort of all stations. Two, Elon Musk will change his mind by tomorrow morning around 3 a.m. and
Totally
say,
possible.
actually, I love Nigel, we're all fine. The third one is the most interesting, because what could happen at this point is that reform find themselves, in the vernacular, growing a pair and saying, maybe we don't need Musk. Maybe we're actually going to back Farage. Maybe we think that his political instincts in this country are better than Musk's. Now, I'm not trying to cheerlead Farage over Musk or indeed Musk over Farage. I'm just saying this could be a moment where reform suddenly goes, if we have to choose between the guy who's kind of going a bit batshit crazy, he looks literally like the spring has come out of his sort of clockwork tummy, right, in some of those tweets. Maybe we just think that Farage is actually, the place we want to be. And maybe it consolidates people around reform who think that Musk is off his trolley.
Well, Farage's tweet is very astute. And as I say, making the best out of a bad situation, in the sense that what Musk is doing, and Farage is doing there, in suggesting that the dividing line between them is about Tommy Robinson, is of course what Musk is doing, is making Farage look centrist.
Yeah.
Or is making him look more mainstream. And
Except that Musk still has the money.
Yeah,
and
of
Farage
course.
would very much like the
He
money.
would have loved the money. But, as I say, if he's not going to get the money, and as you say, Emily, to be fair, he might still get the money.
Yeah,
Musk
yeah.
is so quixotic, mercurial, God knows what he's thinking. He might donate it tomorrow, right? But in this situation, what Farage is doing, Farage is a far cannier reader of British politics and British political realities than Musk is, to say that. I mean, that's not saying much, but it is true. And Farage knows that if the big question, or one of the big questions of British politics for 2025 and onwards, is what is Farage's ceiling in terms of his vote? Because historically, his ceiling has always been lower than he would like, in a sense that he has always had a substantial amount of support in the country, but very often it hasn't been able to overcome a certain level, at a general election of about 12-13%, because there is, among voters who might like Farage on some level, or certainly like some of the things he stands for, worry, concern, particularly from sort of slightly more old school Tory voters, that he might be an extremist. And what is the one thing that would cement that impression in their minds, if there was any sense whatsoever that Farage was making an alliance, making overtures to Tommy Robinson? So he had no choice, if he was serious about building that much bigger coalition of more moderate right-wing voters, than to eschew Robinson. So he had no choice but to do what he's done. And so it could be a long-term plus for him.
Yeah, I think the only danger is if reform wobbles and if they start thinking, ooh, Rupert Lowe, as you're saying, or Ben Habib, who's, exited, in a sort of huff recently, has offered himself up to be the new leader. If there is a sense of reform now splintering or fracturing, again, massively useful to both Keir Starmer, massively useful to the Conservatives, because that gets the reform problem out of the way in a way that would be very sort of useful to both the main parties. But if reform coalesce around Farage and go, sorry, Musk, you're rich but you're wrong, then I think it probably does pull Farage to a place where more people are thinking that he has the backbone to stand up to, extremists, more extremists.
I think the other thing this does, actually, again, about in terms of Musk being a poor reader of political dynamics, I think this diminishes Musk considerably. His association that he's making himself with Robinson, who is such a fringe figure in British politics, at least at the top of British politics. His influence in British politics was partly it's his reach on Twitter, but it was also partly arising from the sense that he had backed a horse, that he was going to back Farage, that they were going to make an alliance, much as he had done with Trump. And if there is a sense, as there seems to be, if there is a rupture between them, and in fact his horse is Robinson, that forces all of the people who have been praising Musk to the rafters over the past few weeks, political figures, senior political figures, the press, the right-wing press, all of them, GB News, it forces them to choose. And by and large, particularly because he's chosen this line in the sand, they will choose Farage.
Well, that's what makes the Badenoch thing so extraordinary.
Yeah.
Because if you actually had to stand there, look her in the eyes and say, this man believes that Tommy Robinson is a victim and a hero, do you? I mean, in what world would that be the answer? And I think she's put herself in a really complicated place now on this. I mean, she can just say, this is not about Tommy Robinson, it's about the grooming gangs, it's about inquiries, it's about investigations. But as we know, there have been, I think, at least 7 different inquiries. This is not to minimise for a moment what happened in Rotherham and the surrounding towns and cities. It was appalling. But the idea, as I think Keir Starmer made earlier, that we need another report rather than just getting on and implementing a report, which the Conservatives had many years to do, seems to be woefully inadequate as a response to the victims of grooming.
Yeah, and as the government pointed out, the most recent report, which was the national one into child sexual abuse, headed by Alexis Jay, which reported only in 2022, took many years, issued at least 20 recommendations that were not implemented.
468 pages.
468 pages.
Do you think Musk has read those?
Well, well, he's awake a lot, so he might be better.
I don't think he reads.
No, I think, hey, Elon, stop tweeting, stop reading tweets, read the report. But those recommendations not implemented by the last government. But I think this point around where it leaves the Conservative Party is really interesting. And I think that whatever happens about this matter, I think what we can definitely say is that the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch, and generally the direction of travel, is moving in a very radical direction on many of these issues, and into a place that only a few years ago would probably have led someone to leave the shadow cabinet or wherever it happened to be if they'd said some of the things they did. I was very, very struck. In all of this, I think the comments of Robert Jenrick, the tweet he sent on the 4th of January, and amongst all of the kind of noise, has got a bit lost and shouldn't have done, because it was an extraordinary tweet. And I'm not going to read, it's quite long, so I'll just read the sort of central bits. But he says that this appalling affair, i.e. the grooming gang scandal, which again is over 10 years old, is the final nail in the coffin for liberals who still cling to the argument that Britain is an integration success story. The scandal started, he says, with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here. And after 30 years, and he says that this is a 30-year disastrous experiment. This is extraordinary language for a senior member of the Conservative Party to use. What he's basically doing there is drawing a direct link between, as he says himself, mass migration and the grooming scandal. What he's basically doing there and saying there is that a particular group, we can presume from this Pakistani men, have a particular problem with grooming, which again the evidence is disputed about, and in particular the logical corollary of that to me, and I asked Chris Philp about this yesterday and he wouldn't want to engage on it, but the corollary of it is to say that Conservative Party thinking right now is to suggest that these people should never have been allowed into the country. This entire group should never have been allowed into the country because there is a basic incompatibility between them and British society. We used to have a word for that. It was called Powellism. That was exactly the argument that Enoch Powell made in 1968 in Rivers of Blood, that there were just some groups of people who were incompatible with British society. And I asked Chris Philp, and I'd like to ask Robert Jenrick, how many, as a percentage of the Pakistani population who are in Britain today, people who've been born here and so on, and are integrated, how many do we think have truck with grooming gangs? 1%? 0.1%? 0.01%?
Look,
and to tar an entire community with that brush, and to tar mass migration with that brush, is astounding.
It's not that far away from what Kemi Badenoch was suggesting, and indeed she's defended Jenrick over these comments when we were at the Conservative Party conference, and she said that some cultures were better than others. She wouldn't then go into what she meant by that, but she talked about alien cultures not being welcomed in Britain. And I think the mistake is to think that what Jenrick said sort of exists in a bubble, because if you look at the policies of somebody like Orban, right, he's been explicit. He's somebody that we would call an illiberal Democrat, right? He's been very explicit on exactly this issue, that he wants Hungary to return to a Christian ethno-nationalist homogeneity, right? This is what Hungary looks like. And I think Jenrick and maybe to some extent Badenoch are looking at figures like him, or looking at the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which has sort of, been in the same place, and said, maybe that is the future of immigration. That is the future of fending off, parties to the right, and saying, yeah, it's worked for Orbán. Electorally, it has worked really well for Orbán. He stayed in power. He went from being a communist, right, in the early days, to being somebody who is very explicit about the need to safeguard what he thinks of as the Hungarian culture.
I mean, that is something, Jenrick's comment, is something that the BNP would have said 15 years ago.
Well, it's something that actually Tommy Robinson said something very, very similar to Newsnight about 10 years ago. I don't know if we can just play a tiny clip.
We're against Islam taken in its 7th century barbaric form.
Well,
Which,
your
when it's
direct
taken,
quote is, I'm not against Muslims, just Islam.
Against militant Islam. And when I say Islam, taken in its 7th century barbaric form. If Islam was to evolve, which it needs to evolve, to fit in with Western democracy, which is clearly not. Clearly there's a problem. Clearly the English Defence League is a phenomenon.
And I guess the pushback to this, and this is where it gets really sensitive and really complicated, is that there will be people all over the country who say, actually, I don't feel comfortable with people coming to this country who believe in arranged marriages, who believed in female genital mutilation, who believe that, Sharia law should be allowed to exist or coexist alongside common law. And I don't know whether it's pockets of people or whether it is a bigger number than that who feel that actually there are parts of Oldham, there are parts of Bradford where their culture is being eroded. And this takes you back, in a sense, to the very question that, is at the heart of this, which is, were the grooming gangs not recognised soon enough by people who should have listened and heard and understood the vulnerabilities there?
And as I say, as we said at the very start, there were clearly too many people in local government, in the justice system, elsewhere, who didn't ask the right questions or ignored the questions because there were cultural sensitivity. That is well established. What is deeply problematic is political actors taking that terrible wrong and taking it out of all proportion and suggesting, hinting that this is a problem which is ubiquitous, which is endemic in a particular community for which there is no evidence whatsoever, and indeed that a particular community has a special proclivity to grooming and child abuse, when we know that most child abuse in this country happens in the family. It's going to be perpetrated by white men. Yes, there may be a particular problem around grooming gangs. There have been white grooming gangs as well. And I think to suggest that, as Jenrick does, that this is a problem which started with mass migration is one that we would have suggested was dog whistle politics until very recently, but now finds itself at the heart, it would seem, of conservative with a small c and a big C thinking and political thinking. And I find that an extraordinary development.
I think more than that, it shows a complete lack of leadership. It just shows an ability to be led wherever the loudest voice of the world is coming from at the moment. I mean, the fact that Jenrick makes those comments now and gets approbation and sort of endorsement, if you like, from Kemi Badenoch suggests that they are happy to be led. That is not leadership.
So, Emily, Elon, even while we've been here, he's still been tweeting this morning. He's going into the polling business, which I'm sure will be fair and balanced. He's been asking his followers whether, quotes, have you ever been polled at by anything like this? America should liberate the people of Britain from their tyrannical government. Yes or no? Your views? How would you vote? Does suggest like he might want the US to invade Britain. Is this what Greenland is for? Maybe this is what Greenland is. Maybe this is what Trump's obsession with Greenland is all about. Greenland's the staging post to the MAGA invasion of Britain.
Do you think this is all about 1776?
Yeah, it's fine.
Do you think it's like
payback?
You know.
Could find yourself.
Where's George the Third now?
We're going to be in prison.
Explain that.
We're going to be in prison. We'll be the political prisoners.
No, we will.
Well, anyway, just for what it's worth, and I'm not sure whether this is binding in a referendum sense, but so far the vote, with 914,450 votes in and 16 hours to go, yes is at 60.6% and no is at 39.4%.
So should we be amassing troops on the Where would they come, do you
Musk
think?
could be Prime Minister
The
in
South
2 weeks.
Coast.
Yeah, well, everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Maybe this is why we do need to increase defence spending.
We do.
Yeah.
So he was right all along. This is
was
just
right all
a way of
along.
getting the NATO number not
Yeah.
higher.
Do you think John will be back by the time that they've invaded?
He might not get in.
He might not get in. Well, there's a silver lining. Yeah.
Silver cloud to every lining.
Silver lining to everything.
We'll be back tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.